time, head online to CBCNews.ca. Hello and welcome inside the CBC Newsroom. I'm Deanna Sumanek-Johnson. We begin with breaking news out of the Middle East and a major development involving the U.S. Donald Trump says the U.S. has carried out a successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran. You're seeing video put out by the Israeli army earlier today of one of those sites. Trump posted on Truth Social that all U.S. planes are safely out of Iranian airspace now. He also said, quote, Iran must now agree to end this war. Trump is expected to address the nation this evening at 10 p.m. Eastern. Now, U.S. President Donald Trump has taken credit for the attack on social media. Last hour, in a Truth Social post, Trump said that a very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran had been carried out, including at Fordow. Trump added all planes are safely on their way home, and he congratulated our great American warriors. Trump ended his post saying, quote, now is the time for peace. Gary Seymour is the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. He previously served in the White House under Barack Obama as an expert on weapons of mass destruction. Seymour told us how he thinks the present administration wants this conflict to play out.
I think Trump genuinely wants to avoid American intervention, mainly because he fears that it could lead to a prolonged conflict between the U.S. and Iran. If the U.S. attacks this Fordow enrichment facility, most people think Iran is likely to retaliate against U.S. bases in the region. And of course, U.S. bases are well within range of short-range ballistic missiles that Iran still has plenty of. They haven't been using them against Israel. And that could lead to a long conflict between the U.S. and Iran that could destabilize oil markets. So Trump, I think, hopes that the threat of U.S. intervention will be sufficient to intimidate Iran into accepting a deal that would close down Fordow under international supervision. So far, the Iranians have not shown much willingness to accept the closure of Fordow. At the end of the day, they might put forward some temporary closure as a way to avoid a clash with the United States, but the Iranians seem determined at this point anyway to keep the facility in running, and they may think that Trump is so reluctant to attack that he'll back down at the end.
CBC's Chris Brown joins us right now from Jerusalem. Chris, it's hard to underestimate the magnitude of this involvement, of these news. What else do we know right now?
Well, the signs certainly had been pointing to it all day yesterday, Jerusalem time. We'd seen all the various internet trackers watching the B-2 bombers take off from their bases in the middle of the United States, flying towards Guam. Once this massive operation started to roll, it was actually quite hard to see Donald Trump turning it back. So what we know as of this moment is that 3 nuclear sites were attacked: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. The key one, of course, is Fordow, buried very deep into the mountain in the middle of Iran. It was designed to be impregnable. This is the heart of the Ayatollah's nuclear program. Lots of centrifuges spinning all the time, deep underground, as I say, creating this enriched uranium. It was thought to be impregnable, and indeed, Israel more or less acknowledged that without putting its own troops on the ground in a very difficult, if not impossible operation, that it was going to take something more than they had. This was always the dynamic. And in fact, many people believe this is probably perhaps what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had on his mind at the beginning. He would start this war about 9 days ago now with Iran, with massive attacks from Israeli missiles and from drones and from its aircraft on many of the above ground sites. And then it would require these American strikes to come in and essentially finish off the program. And there's other underground sites we understand that were hit as well, also in Natanz. We'd seen Natanz attacked before again by the Israelis, but that was largely above ground. So, yeah, we'll have to wait to hear exactly from the president and look to see what the damage assessment is. But these giant bombs that the Americans reportedly used had never been used in anger in combat before. They were designed to penetrate deep underground. The Fordow facility believed to be somewhere around 90 meters underground, and we understand it's no more. Obviously, Deanna, the key question now, always the major concern was, what is the response of Iran going to be? They were warning not to do this to the United States, they sent the warning to the United States, don't do this, because although weakened, Iran still has options. There are lots of U.S. military targets much closer to Iran than where we are here in Jerusalem, and perhaps much easier for Iran's short-range missiles to target. There's military bases, there's lots of oil infrastructure, energy infrastructure, there's tankers. They could try to close the Strait of Hormuz. So this really, the ball really now is over to the Ayatollahs, and particularly Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. What will he do? It seems very hard to believe that there will be no kind of response from Iran. It's hard to believe that for a couple of, that's right. It's hard to believe that for a couple of reasons, just because this is going to be a massive blow to his regime. And no doubt the population, particularly the hardliners who surround him, will be pushing him for some kind of forceful response.
Chris, I wanted to ask you, I mean, you've been covering the region for a while. For the longest time, even a conflict between Israel and Iran, let alone Iran and Israel backed by the U.S. military, has been the big bad, the conflict that everyone, certainly in the international community, had feared would erupt. What potential other consequences does the U.S. involvement bring into question, in addition to possible, perhaps even likely retaliation from the Ayatollah, as you just pointed out?
Well, don't forget, it's been a very bad week, 8-9 days now for the Iranians. The Israeli Air Force has owned the skies over that country. They've not lost a single fighter jet. The only casualty that we know of is a lone drone that the Iranians managed to shoot down. So they've been able to operate and take out lots of military facilities, particularly that fired these long-range ballistic missiles that have been landing all over where we are here. But beyond, Iran still packs a punch. And so, again, this really was the worry. We have not seen a true regional war that draws in all of these other aspects, if you will, and that's the major concern. It's middle of the night here. We haven't heard from Donald Trump yet. Things are quiet. I think it's probably fair to speculate that the Americans will be hoping this is effectively a one and done, that just as in a few years ago when they assassinated the top general, Qasem Soleimani, that top Iranian general, there was no immediate major response. Basically, the Americans were able to get away with it. So that may be trying to peer into the head of the American strategists what the thinking is, that they can fly in, drop these bombs on the nuclear sites, and that's it. And it's notable that we have not heard anything else at this moment about attacks on other parts of Iran's infrastructure. We have not heard about attacks on military bases, for example. And that's different from what Israel did. Israel targeted many, many things. They targeted the 3 nuclear facilities, as I mentioned, but they've also been going hard, assassinating scientists, assassinating military leaders, and also hitting military installations as well. So the American strike appears at this point to be massive, but targeted and focused. And the hours ahead will obviously tell exactly what the response of Iran is. But as I say, from an American perspective, it does not appear at this moment that they're going further than that.
Further than that, Chris, I know it's the middle of the night in Jerusalem where you are, but what has the Israeli reaction been of Israeli people to this conflict with Iran, which has lasted for about 9 days so far? And obviously, Israel is still involved in the war in Gaza. Some of the hostages have still not been returned. What's the mood of the Israelis, from as far as you've seen, about this conflict with Iran?
I think it's fair to say that mostly Israelis have been pleased with how this has gone. I think Iran has been seen as an arch enemy far beyond the Prime Minister's office, far beyond Benjamin Netanyahu's office. And I think that there is certainly a sentiment here that, the Ayatollah, so to speak, had it coming. So there was some satisfaction in that. I think that was tempered the following days when some of those ballistic missiles began landing. 24 Israelis have been killed in these attacks in cities such as Haifa. Just the other night, we saw some 40 people wounded. And so that has tempered things, but there did seem to be this momentum building up towards this strike here. We understand that there were conversations, Reuters is reporting, between Israeli officials and American officials, even as these bombers were in the sky. Big question comes about, why did Israel act when it did 9 days ago in order to launch this war? They seem to feel that they had a window where Iran was weak, a window perhaps where their jets could fly unopposed over Syria and into Iran. And so there's always these tactical timings, and this may also have been the case with that if they waited longer, perhaps Iran would be able to perhaps move some of its supplies of enriched uranium elsewhere and make it much harder, again, from a strategic and tactical point of view, in order to carry this out. So no doubt, very soon you're going to hear statements from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that are going to sound perhaps even euphoric. This will achieve one of his long-time political goals, so they're going to be very happy. And I also think that, don't forget, it is Israel that has been driving the timing on all of this, Deanna. There were negotiations, there were talks and discussions going on, supposed to be more meetings with the Iranians in Oman the Sunday after these attacks started, Thursday night into Friday morning. So this has been Israel's schedule that all of this has been unfolding under, and it often has appeared that Donald Trump has been responding to Benjamin Netanyahu's timeline, and I think you're going to, as daylight arises here, and we start to hear more Israeli response. I think you're going to find that this is perhaps exactly going to their plans.
Chris, just while we still have you, I know, obviously, U.S. has picked its side, and Donald Trump, even though he initially said he will mull over this for 14 days, he'd made up his mind on how to act right now. There are countries that have been backing Iran more, or have certainly been more pro-diplomatic solution. Notably, Russia and China have put up a united front. Xi and Putin have both said that a diplomatic solution should be found, and have discouraged U.S. from bombing Iran. We know that both those countries have been supportive towards Iran in previous circumstances. What do you foresee happening when it comes to countries like Russia, China, or North Korea, which has been very openly anti-Israel, and in terms of their potential of supplying Iran with armaments or offering other kinds of support to Iran?
Well, the global reaction will probably be negative on many quarters. Russia, just the other day, Vladimir Putin was urging Donald Trump not to go down this route, as were the Chinese, and frankly, as was the United Nations. Rafael Grossi, the head of the IAEA, the nuclear monitor, the watchdog that the UN has, attacking a nuclear-powered site, attacking supplies, stores of enriched uranium, could be very dangerous. Now, I've not heard anyone suggest at this moment, before tonight, that there was a concrete example of any radiation, for example, leaking. But they were talking about one of the functioning plants on the Persian Gulf coast. Iran has one of those. That was sort of almost off limits. It does not appear that that particular facility in Bashir was hit. So from a purely containment point of view, this may not be a problem. But from a political point of view, as I say, we had the Chinese, we had the Russians, and we had regional countries expressing, concern exactly about the impact of this. The Gulf countries will be very interesting. Those, in a way, are Iran's neighbors. They're also Israel's neighbors. They're also Arab countries, but they're Sunni Arab countries, unlike the Shia in Iran. And their role in this has been very interesting. They have not, they've been very quiet. I think privately, anything that weakens Iran, their longtime adversary, was seen as a good thing up to a point. So perhaps there will be some quiet applause coming from places in Saudi, in the UAE. The Europeans had been on a diplomatic track. There were meetings in Geneva. There were lots of discussions about trying to push this process forward. Emmanuel Macron was talking about that just hours ago. That process has obviously failed. Again, the Europeans being much more cautious. It's not in their interest for Iran to have a nuclear facility, to have enriched uranium, to be able to possibly build a bomb within just a couple of months. Nonetheless, a regional war was something they were very much trying to avoid because there's just so much that's unknown. I mean, we really don't know what the impacts are going to be because we don't know what Iran's going to do. But the potential is there, as I say, blocking the Straits of Hormuz, attacking oil infrastructure, attacking gas infrastructure, attacking American assets. All of that could lead to high gas prices. It could lead to a plummet in the global economy. So for lots of reasons, there were many people opposed to what happened tonight.
Chris, thank you so much for bringing us all that context and analysis in the middle of the night in Jerusalem. And I know you'll be there in the region for us in the days to come. Really appreciate this. That's CBC's Chris Brown reporting in Jerusalem. And just summing up our breaking news tonight, U.S. and President Donald Trump have confirmed that U.S. struck 3 Iranian nuclear sites at Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Donald Trump on Truth Social said that the U.S. bombers are now safely out of the Iranian airspace. Of course, this raises so many questions about the reaction of the international community as well as possible retaliation from Iran. Donald Trump had said now is time for peace. Questions remain, of course, whether Iranians will see it that way as well. Now, many Canadian Iranians right here at home are worried about family members in Iran. Earlier on, we spoke to Bahar Motamadian in Maple Ridge, BC. Her father is in Iran, and she told us how difficult it's been just getting in touch with him.
The very last time that I had a direct conversation, I could talk to him on the phone, was on Monday. We were discussing the ways that we can take him out of Iran. We were thinking, okay, maybe he can go through Persian Gulf, going through some Arabian countries in south of Iran, and then we can get him a Canadian ticket to come here because he still has a valid Canadian visa. But he told us that he's scared those cities by Persian Gulf are not safe. There are news of bombing in those cities, and he would rather to stay home. but I was happy to hear his voice yesterday. He was able to call my brother's phone here, and my brother called me through another phone, put both phones on a speaker, and I could hear his voice. I could tell him how much I love him, and that he should take care of himself. I would love to have him here. I don't know how, but maybe the short-term plan is being able to call him. It's just not possible. And I hear something is happening, a bombing is happening close to where he is, and I can't check on him. He's alone. I don't have anybody right now in the city to check on him, and it just super stressful. I don't know what to do. I just want to be able to pick up the phone and call him and check on him whenever I want to. My main concern is that he has hearing issues. He also has some knee problems. He can walk really fast. I'm worried that if something happens around him, I don't think he can run away. I don't really think he can hear, or it's just devastating. I don't know what to do.
And from personal to global repercussions, let's stay on this story and bring in Gary Seymour. He's the director of the Crown Center for Middle East Studies at Brandeis University. From 2009 to 2013, he served as President Barack Obama's White House coordinator for arms control and weapons of mass destruction. Gary, welcome back to our program. You and I spoke earlier.
Thank you, Deanna.
You and I spoke earlier in what seemed to be a very different world just a few hours ago. We now know that President Donald Trump had said on Truth Social that the United States military has successfully completed its airstrikes on nuclear sites in Iran. What is your reaction?
Well, I had hoped that Trump would allow a little bit more time for diplomacy, although I wasn't very optimistic. Obviously, he lost patience, I think in part because the Iranians refused to even hold a meeting with American diplomats. So now the big question will be, how will Iran retaliate? And will that lead to a broader conflict? I know the U.S. will try to dissuade Iran, will try to warn Iran not to retaliate, but I think there will be at least some retaliation, especially against U.S. Bases and personnel in the Persian Gulf. Whether that retaliation will be token or whether it will be more sustained, I think we won't know the answer to for a matter of hours. But I do think there will be some kind of Iranian retaliation, and then we'll see whether or not they kill or injure American service people, and Trump will have to decide how he wants to respond to that.
We certainly know that that has been the threat issued by Ayatollah Khamenei prior to U.S. involvement in this conflict. I mean, how does the U.S. involvement change things? Donald Trump had said this is a one-off. He's now hoping that this opens up or expedites channels for diplomacy. How likely is that?
Well, I think it depends a lot on what Iran's calculation is. If Iran wants to make a token retaliation, as they did after the U.S. killed General Soleimani back in 2020, then it may possibly lead to opportunity for diplomacy. Although there's obviously much less to negotiate now that Iran's nuclear program lies in ruins. But if the Iranian retaliation is larger scale and extends beyond U.S. bases to threaten shipping in the Persian Gulf or even oil facilities in the Arab countries of the Gulf, then we could be in for a much longer conflict between the U.S. and Iran.
Talk to me about what this means for the overall stability in the region. Our correspondent Chris Brown and I were just talking about this. For the longest time, the war between Israel and Iran two major powers in the Middle East was the big bad that everybody was hoping would not happen. Now this is happening in addition to the U.S. military involvement. Again, something that Donald Trump, up until now, and his predecessors have always tried to avoid. What does this mean for stability in the region?
So, we don't know the answer to that. It depends on what Iran's calculation is. One way of thinking is that, at least in the past, Iran has been very cautious about retaliation. And if you look back at the U.S. Killing of General Soleimani, the Iranians fired a small number of missiles at U.S. facilities in Iraq. They didn't kill anyone. They injured some American personnel, and Trump decided not to retaliate. So that's one model, a token retaliation that doesn't lead to a broader conflict. In this case, it's possible that the Iranians may feel that they have no choice but a much more sustained, larger scale retaliation against the U.S., and even a retaliation against countries where the U.S. has bases. So that would be Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, United Arab Emirates, and so forth. It would be somewhat suicidal for Iran to escalate, but I think, this is a regime that's under tremendous strain. They've lost a lot of their top military leaders. Their political leader, Supreme Leader Khamenei, is apparently in hiding. So I don't think we can be sure about how restrained and rational the Iranian response will be. And that's what everybody will be looking for in the next 24 hours.
What happens in terms of the impact of the rest of the international community? I mean, we know that the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres was here in Canada for the G7 summit just about a week ago, and was strongly urging all sides involved to end this conflict and urging the U.S. not to get involved. We know that Putin and Xi have joined and have issued a joint statement urging the U.S. to not get involved. And these are countries that have been more sympathetic towards Iran in the past. What reactions can we expect from other global players?
Well, it's a very good question. I mean, I would expect the Russians and the Chinese would be critical of the American reaction. I think the Europeans and Canada will be much more restrained in their criticism because nobody has much sympathy for Iran's nuclear program, which almost every country in the world believes was intended to create a nuclear weapons capability. But I expect there'll be a lot of private messages to Iran not to escalate, not to retaliate in a way that leads to further conflict. So presumably the U.S. government is asking the Europeans and the Turks and the Russians and the Chinese and the Arab countries of the Gulf to pass the message to Iran that the U.S. is not seeking to invade the country, U.S. is not seeking to change the government or kill the supreme leader, and the U.S. is prepared to return to a negotiation. As I said, I think Iran is likely to retaliate despite those messages from the United States, and the question is whether the retaliation will be a token one or whether it will be large scale and sustained.
Gary, while we still have you, I want to ask you about the domestic impact of this too. I mean, one of the things that led to Donald Trump's popularity and got him back in the White House is his professed isolationist stance in terms of U.S. staying out of foreign wars, out of dangerous situations, out of engaging with countries that could retaliate against U.S. Army or U.S. citizens, for that matter. How do you think this is going to, what repercussions is Donald Trump possibly going to face over this at home, where the situation is already quite unstable in a lot of ways?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that there's very little public sympathy in the United States toward Iran. I mean, Iran is seen as an enemy country, hostile to the United States. If the U.S. attack is successful, and it's limited to damage to these 3 nuclear facilities and doesn't lead to a broader conflict, I think it will enhance Trump's popularity. If this leads to a longer-term conflict where there's casualties, American casualties in the region, or terrorist attacks on American personnel or facilities around the world, or a spike in oil prices, then I think President Trump will face some political damage from starting this attack.
Tell me, how do you think this conflict, as it stands right now, which again, with the U.S. involvement, is so different than it was just when you and I spoke earlier today, what's the possibility of this ending, and ending diplomatically, which Donald Trump professes is his goal?
Well, the war will end diplomatically in the sense that there's no possibility of the United States invading and occupying Iran. So in that sense, this is not like Afghanistan and Iraq, where the U.S. actually occupied those countries and then had to engage in a process of trying to establish a stable political system with very painful and mixed results, especially in Afghanistan. So in that sense, this war is going to eventually result in some kind of a truce or ceasefire. The question, I think, will be how long that will take, how much damage will be done in the meantime.
Gary, thank you so much for your expertise and analysis tonight. We really relied a lot on your insight, so I really appreciate you making time for us tonight.
Thank you, Deanna. It was great to talk to you. I wish this were a happier occasion.
On a happier
but
note.
We'll see how things go.
Thank you. Thank you, Gary. That was Gary Seymour. Now, if you're just joining us right now, there's a major development involving the U.S. in the ongoing Israel-Iran war. Donald Trump says the U.S. has carried out an attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran. This is video put out by the Israeli army earlier today of one of those sites. Trump is expected to address the nation this evening at 10 p.m. Eastern. And in a Truth Social post, Donald Trump said that a very successful attack on 3 nuclear sites in Iran had been carried out, including at Fordow. Trump added, quote, "All planes are safely on their way home," and he congratulated our great American warriors. Trump ended his post by saying, "Now is the time for peace." And our Chris Brown is going to be joining us just shortly. But just before we do, I wanted to sum up some of the news that we're getting in the last 15 minutes or so, coming from both Iran and from Israel. We do know that the Iranian state media, the state Iranian Broadcasting Corporation, has confirmed that those nuclear sites have been struck. We also know that they said that they have been struck by, quote, enemy forces. We also know that there's some news coming out of Israel now, which is that there is a different level of defense that Israeli army is suggesting for its citizens right now, which really suggests that they're anticipating a possible retaliatory attack, or for Iran to strengthen or intensify its attacks. Now we're going to go to our Chris Brown, who joins us again from Jerusalem. It is the middle of the night where you are, Chris. What are you hearing right now, and what do we know so far?
Well, we know that Donald Trump has taken action that lots of his predecessors thought about, perhaps wanted to do, but held off on. So from the U.S. presidency, it really is a historic moment, a plunge, though, into the unknown, because the fear of presidents such as Bill Clinton, Barack Obama, all of whom had talked about a need to limit Iran's nuclear program, was that once you start a war, it's very difficult to know how it's going to end or if you can control it. And so that's the moment that we're at now. What we understand is that 3 sites were attacked: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. Fordow is a key one, buried deep underground, somewhere around 80, 90 meters underground. That's where the uranium enrichment was happening. We actually don't know how much uranium was there because the IAEA had not been into that site for quite some time to check. But it was seen to be the heart, the key to Iran's nuclear program, and very, very difficult to get at. Israel started this war about 9 days ago now, and its fighters and bombers and missiles and drones have been attacking above ground targets, not so much in Fordo, but in places like Isfahan and Natanz. And they had done damage. The Iranians had said they'd done damage. We'd seen the satellite photographs suggesting all of that. But Fordo was the one that on their own, or certainly not without putting troops on the ground in a highly risky military move that required American help. It required these American B-2 bombers to fly all the way around the world from the middle of the United States, refueling multiple times, stopping in Guam, and finally launching what we believe, these bunker-busting bombs that had never been used before in combat, in anger, at basically this mountain. So we'll have to see. We've seen a few social media posts from inside Iran saying, well, anything that was in there that was important, we'd already moved out. We'll have to see. And we'll also obviously have to await what the response of Iran is going to be. They have lots of options, as your guests have been saying. In Jerusalem, beyond in Israel, we know that they have tightened their security preparations, only essential activities. So when this war was initiated by Israel, that was the orders to people: only do essential activities, stay at home, and so forth. Then they were loosened a little bit. Now they're back to being tight again. We're also hearing a few statements coming out of the Israeli government that Israel was in the loop on this and that they participated in it. But again, that's really all we know in terms of how this played out tactically as well. Israeli jets essentially cleared the skies in the opening hours of this war, taking out the S-300 Russian-made anti-missile systems that Iran had. We've not seen any examples of Iran's Air Force taking to the skies, attacking here, or even getting into dogfights with some of the Israeli fighters. So it's been, I won't say easygoing, but they've certainly not encountered much opposition to date. The opposition, as it were, has come from the ballistic missiles that Iran has been firing in retaliation at Israel over the last week or so. Actually, to my knowledge, we haven't had a report or even a warning of one in about 12 hours, maybe even more than that now. That's quite unusual. The first few hours of this war, there were 100 waves of 100 that were fired. We did see some getting through. We did see casualties, but they've really kind of trickled off in the last little bit. And that could suggest that Israel has been very successful at targeting either the missile storage sites or the missile launchers or the command and control systems that are responsible for it. So there's many, many, many pieces at play here, Deanna. And as the hours go by, we'll obviously everyone waiting now to see what comes next. The Americans will hope that this is essentially a one and done, that there will not be a regional-wide retaliation by Iran, which is the greatest fear, but we don't know.
We don't know. So much we don't know right now. Chris, we have some of the breaking news right now. Trump acknowledges that he spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu after the strikes. This is as per a White House official. And he also said in a brief interview with our colleagues at Reuters that Iran should not try anything else, or, quote, they will get hit again. Tell me, Chris, what does this mean? What does the U.S. involvement mean for the regional stability?
I think over the next few hours, there's going to be a lot of anxiety. There's lots of potential ways that Iran can go with this. They can do almost nothing if they want. They can say, well, potentially there was nothing in those sites anyways. We moved everything. Let's let this one go. That is what the Americans will hope happens. That's what the Israelis will happen. In fact, that's what most of the world will hope happens. It seems unlikely, though. This is a regime that will probably feel compelled to take some kind of response for domestic purposes and also to show some kind of deterrence as well to Israel. And they do have options. We've been talking about some of the missiles that have been flying into Israel, but they have much shorter range missiles as well that can hit, for example, energy platforms and in the Persian Gulf, ships carrying oil, also U.S. bases and other soft targets, embassies. Iran could deploy car bombers, for example, if they want to go along a state-sponsored terrorism route. And again, it is a Pandora's box of awful options that awaits. And that has been one of the major concerns that has held back, as I say, almost every other president, not almost every other president, up until now. So I would suspect you will see some kind of response. It's just early hours yet. No sirens have gone off here in Israel, but I'm sure something is coming.
Thank you so much for that, Chris. That's CBC's Chris Brown reporting in Jerusalem. This is the image of the White House where some major international news took place tonight. Donald Trump had acknowledged that U.S. bombers were involved in strikes on 3 nuclear facilities in Iran, joining Israel's war with Iran and bringing a whole new dimension to that conflict. And I wanted to let you know that CBC News Network's host, Natasha Fatah, is with us tonight as well. I know that you're so knowledgeable on this region and that you've been following this conflict very closely. What are we just learning right now? And what do you say of this major development? What does this mean in the broader story of the region?
Well, I think that's the thing that's making so many people's heads spin, Deanna, as you've been covering with some of the people you've been speaking with, is the speed with which all of this has happened. It was only a week ago that when Israel began its bombing strikes against Iran, the world was asking the question they always ask when these things flare up. Is the United States going to step in? We know that it supports Israel from a defensive position, but are they now going to take a military strike themselves? And the answer almost unanimously last week was no, absolutely not. The United States cannot afford to get dragged into this. This would open up a Pandora's box of a crisis for the region and for the U.S. We need only to look back at U.S. foreign policy in Iraq and more recently in Afghanistan to know that sometimes the Americans, as well-intentioned as they may be, the results of their entrance into one of these wars and then their exit creates more problems than it's worth for the population of those nations. So what we've seen in just the past few days is the president saying, I'm giving myself 2 weeks to make a decision. He did not utilize the entire 2 weeks, despite what so many analysts were saying. He's going to wait. He's weighing his options. He's allowing diplomacy to play its role. No, he hasn't. He's used that time, really 2.5 days, to move the armament where he needed to move it. We know from earlier today he was moving those B-2 bombers into Guam. Now, we couldn't project from that this was going to lead to a bombing in Iran. But certainly, why move it unless there is some intentionality behind that, whether it's to send a message or to actually deploy them into action. And so we know that they've been hit. And what's fascinating about this is because sometimes from Iran, we don't get the full story. We don't know if they're going to even acknowledge what's going to happen. Part of the crisis with the bombing last week from Israel was we didn't know how many people had been injured or killed in Iran.
Because there's no free media, no international media allowed inside Iran.
Exactly. And the media that is there is controlled by the regime. So all of that we were reporting with, take it with a grain of salt. The regime has a certain image, certain propaganda that it needs to put out. And so now what we're hearing from the Israelis, from the Iranians directly is they're acknowledging Fordow has been hit. Nuclear sites in Iran have been hit today by the United States. So we're not...
Makes you wonder why they're acknowledging it as well, because what's coming up next? Is there a possible retaliation?
Well, this is the thing. And can Iran afford to pull the United States deeper into this? Because if we look at the latest statements coming from the U.S. president, he's saying, that's it. It's been successful.
He's hoping
We're
this is
done.
a deterrent,
Yes.
basically. Yeah.
And he said, get in line, get with the diplomacy, get with the negotiating, or we're going to come at you again. So he's used a very hard measure to try and implore the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table, to get back to some sort of nuclear deal that they could go back to, something akin to what they had in 2015 that President Trump walked away from. But now what his administration is proposing is very similar to what the Obama administration had put into effect. So I think the big thing right now is the speed with which this has all happened.
Right.
What will be the Iranian response? They've been threatening, we're going to come after the US. You are now targets if you get involved. Are they going to follow through with that threat? That will be dicey.
That's the big question. And we've seen Trump's impulsiveness at play when it came to domestic policy. Certainly his dealings with protesters against the immigration raids, his dealings with governors of certain states like Gavin Newsom of California, but certainly not on an international stage. And his isolationist stance, his saying, I don't want to get embroiled in these bloody foreign wars, unlike my predecessors, was partially what made him popular among the American public. I think it's going to be very interesting how this plays out in Washington as well. We have to go to, speaking of Washington, we got to go to Washington, but I wanted to let our viewers know Natasha will be with us for the rest of the night as well, walking you through this developing situation together with me. Now, let's go to Washington right now, where we're joined by CBC's Karen Pauls. Karen, tell us from Washington vantage point, what do we know so far about this U.S. attack?
I mean, we first heard about the attack on that social media post by Donald Trump earlier, just over an hour ago, saying we have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran. All planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo, and all planes are safely on their way home. He congratulated the military, saying there was no other military in the world that could have done this, and now is the time for peace. President Donald Trump has also announced he will deliver an address to the nation at 10 o'clock local time in about 40 minutes from the White House. That tweet, that social media post saying this is an historic moment for the United States of America, Israel, and the world. Iran must now agree to end this war. Again, those nuclear sites in Iran are Fordo, that's the one buried in the mountain, Natanz, and Isfahan. Trump also posted in that media post that Fordo is gone. And we know that American B-2 bombers are the only planes that can carry the bombs that can target that installation inside the mountain. We're hearing now Iran's state-run news agency has acknowledged the attack on the Fordo nuclear site. They're saying a few hours ago, air defenses were activated and hostile targets were identified, and part of the nuclear site was attacked by enemies. Earlier today, we heard that several U.S. B-2 bombers appeared to have taken off from the Air Force Base in Missouri and were heading west. We were told, U.S. defense officials saying no order had been given to move forward with those B-2s. They were apparently flying over the Pacific and appeared to be headed toward Guam, but that didn't mean they were saying, the officials, that an operation was imminent. Rather, something to provide the president with some options. The White House didn't respond to a request for comment. Trump returned from his golf course in New Jersey tonight and met with his national security team in the Oval Office. And again, those B-2 bombers are the only planes capable of carrying that so-called bunker-busting bomb, the only kind of bomb potentially capable of destroying that underground nuclear facility. They can carry, each of those bombers can carry 2 bombs, which weigh 30,000 pounds each. And we know that the U.S. State Department has started evacuating Americans from Israel. We know officials say President Trump did give Israel a heads up about this operation. And he's now telling Reuters in a phone call, this was an amazing success tonight. Iran should make peace or they will be hit again. And again, just 2 days ago, Trump said he was giving himself up to 2 weeks to make up his mind about what to do. So this happened very quickly.
Yeah, Karen, that's that impulsiveness that Natasha and I were just talking about. And certainly, you being in Washington, that you've seen that impulsiveness firsthand when it comes to domestic policy decisions of Donald Trump. But we've never seen something quite like this on an international external policy scale. Speaking of a reaction, have you heard any reaction yet, either from the U.S. or from the international community?
We're starting to hear a little bit domestically. Speaker Mike Johnson tweeting, "The military operations in Iran should serve as a clear reminder to our adversaries and allies that President Trump means what he says." The president gave every opportunity to make a deal, but Iran refused to commit to a nuclear disarmament agreement. President Trump has been consistent and clear that a nuclear-armed Iran will not be tolerated, and that posture has now been enforced with strength, precision, and clarity. This is still Speaker Mike Johnson in a social media post. He's saying, again, the president's decisive action prevents the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, which chants death to America, from obtaining the most lethal weapon on the planet. This is America First policy in action. God bless our brave men and women in uniform, and we pray for their safe return home. We're also hearing from Senator John Fetterman saying this is the correct move by the President of the United States. Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and cannot have nuclear capabilities. He's grateful and salutes the finest military in the world. But then we're also hearing from Congresswoman Yasemin Ansari saying Donald Trump illegally took military action against Iran without congressional authorization, risking dragging us into another endless war. I'm calling for an immediate emergency session of Congress to vote on the War Powers Resolution. And we know there has been division not only with Democrats, but also within the Republican Party, within conservatives. Some saying they wanted the president to strike, that it was necessary to do so if they wanted to ensure that Iran would have no nuclear weapons. But the MAGA wing has been saying, no, we voted for you. During the election, you said that you would not be entering us into these foreign wars, and we expect you to stick to that promise. So there has been some internal division, some tension, and this came up so quickly. It will be interesting to see what that reaction will be and what will happen next.
Thank you so much for that, Karen. That's CBC's Karen Pauls in Washington.
Okay, everyone, if you're just joining us here on CBC News Network, my name is Natasha Fatah. I'm joining my friend and colleague Diana Sumanak-Johnson as she has been bringing you the breaking news of the evening. President Donald Trump has now confirmed that the U.S. military has struck 3 sites in Iran, directly joining Israel's effort to hinder the country's nuclear program. This represents a major escalation in the war that has been taking place now for 10 days between Israel and Iran, and now, presumably, the United States is involved. So for more on this developing story, we are joined now by Iran expert Eric Loeb. He is an associate professor for politics and international relations at Florida International University in Miami. Professor Loeb, thank you so much for making time for us today.
Thanks for having me.
Can we begin with what I think for Professor, which is, what do you anticipate we're going to hear from President Trump at 10 p.m. Eastern?
Well, of course, it's difficult to entirely predict what his speeches and statements will consist of. But if I had to guess, and based on immediate social media postings in the immediate aftermath of these strikes, it would seem that he would be taking a victory lap and applauding U.S. forces for successfully carrying out these strikes, reminiscent of President George W. Bush's mission accomplished speech back when the U.S. invaded and occupied Iraq in 2003. Something else he may say as well is, and that we're seeing on social media postings by the president, is that even in the wake of these military attacks and strikes by the U.S. against Iranian nuclear facilities, that he would be leaving the door open for diplomacy and negotiations over Iran's nuclear program and perhaps other aspects of the Iranian regime.
How do you anticipate the Iranians are going to react? Because up until tonight, what we had heard from not only the regime in Iran, but also from the Houthis and presumably by the other proxy organizations throughout the Middle East that are bolstered by Iran, that they would retaliate if the United States got involved in some capacity.
Right. So now we're at a critical moment to see if Iran is actually going to back up those words. We would expect to see some very strong statements coming from the Iranian leadership and officials in Iran about, and already we're seeing these statements coming out, calling this an act of U.S. aggression and enmity, and that the Iranians will take strong steps to retaliate, and we'll see if they actually follow through with tangible actions, whether it's striking at U.S. assets, military bases and personnel in the region, or even closing or disrupting commercial shipping and oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, which is a very important economic site. And then, of course, whether Iranian proxies will get involved, although Hezbollah was starting to dial up the rhetoric and was hit by Israeli strikes earlier this weekend. And then, so they may be thinking twice. But the Houthis are, again, making strong statements as they've done in the past, and even taking action of disrupting commercial shipping in the Red Sea, even after in the wake of a ceasefire with the U.S. Just a couple of months ago.
Can we measure Iran's capabilities at this point? Because they've been so beat up in the last year and a half with the ongoing wars taking place with Israel. And this is not the first time Israel has struck at Iran. I just wonder if they have the capabilities to mount a much larger attack if other nations were pulled in, if Iraq joins this fight, if Syria gets involved.
Well, it'd be unlikely that other regional actors would get involved, given the adversity they're facing at home with Syria's new government, with Iraq having instability since the U.S. invasion and occupation. Perhaps trying to contain Iran-backed Shia militias from dragging Iraq into a conflict with Israel and the United States. But in terms of Iran's capabilities, I mean, this is really the million-dollar question, whether Iran still has a robust and sizable missile arsenal and drone arsenal, and even whether it has enough launchers at this point that haven't been hit by Israel to launch a meaningful retaliation. Either continuing to strike at Israel or now at U.S. targets in the region. And so we'll see in terms of how the Iranians can respond. I mean, even if they've been severely degraded since the Gaza war of October 7th and their partners and proxies, it's still a very dangerous and tenuous situation, given that their backs are increasingly against the wall. And for existential and survival purposes, they may strike out at all costs at this point.
Professor, let me ask you about any prospects, any hope for diplomacy at this point, because even now, in this moment, President Trump is saying, hey, Iran, get back to the diplomatic table, get back to negotiating, or else. Is there a path for that right now?
Well, the question is what are the Iranians and the Americans going to negotiate over at this point? I mean, again, we still have to wait and see and assess the damage has been done to Iranian nuclear sites. The three sites, their main sites that were struck today. And again, there may be facilities elsewhere. I mean, Israel has struck the inactive, largely inactive Iraq reactor. But if the negotiations were about the Iran nuclear program, and there's not much of a nuclear program to speak of at this point, again, assessing the damage that has been done, then what will they be negotiating over? If anything but a ceasefire. But, right now at this point, the Iranians, are maybe, not in a position right now to come to a negotiating table to try to save face and to even, assess what their options are and what possible responses they may have militarily if they even want to continue to risk escalation and further reprisals from the U.S. and Israel.
Okay, Eric Loeb, thank you again so much for your time and for your insights.
And CBC's Chris Brown is joining us again from Jerusalem. Chris, this is a developing story. We're starting to get reactions from U.S. politicians and from the international community on this. What do we know so far, and what are you hearing where you are?
Well, we're hearing that there was obviously a fair bit of coordination between the Israeli government, the Israeli military, and what unfolded in Iran tonight. That is not a surprise. Israel started this war 9 nights ago by sending in its bombers and missiles and drones and attacked essentially what it could, largely above ground sites in these 3 facilities, Isfahan, Fordo, and Natanz. And there was a lot of it that they did damage, and we've seen the satellite pictures that the Iranians even have released and confirmed. The IAEA has been out and saying, yes, there has been a lot of damage, but it was this deeply buried, thought to be impregnable site at Fordo underground, which is really what the big news is tonight and why it's so important. This is at the heart of Iran's nuclear power, nuclear energy, and potentially nuclear weapons program. Everything, all these centrifuges, it's all buried, was buried deep underground, about 80 meters or so, underneath a mountain in reinforced bunkers. And so just getting at this was thought to be extremely difficult, even for the United States and even with all of its technology. It's quite notable that in the minutes after this attack, a couple of the phone calls that Donald Trump appears to have made were to American journalists, where he gave a few more details about exactly what happened and how this attack went out. It appears that the U.S. dropped these MOP, these massive ordnance penetrating bombs, some 30,000 pounds, or about 30 tons. And just to give you an example, a regular bomb is like 1 ton. So these are enormous pieces of ordnance that have never been used in anger, never been used in war, dropped from B-2 bombers that flew all the way around the world, starting their journey hours and hours ago in the middle of the United States, stopping in Guam, getting refueled. Their path was in fact tracked by lots of people on the internet. So all day there had been some sense that this was building, and really it almost seemed at some point that this was more up to Donald Trump to rescind the order than to give it, because it did seem like all of this was in play. But even with all of that, one of the concerns going into this was, can this actually work? Because it's not clear. Nothing like this has ever been tried before. Some of the early statements, quasi-semi-official statements coming out of Iran has been, well, we've already moved everything that was important out of these sites. And indeed, there's some evidence to suggest that some of the enriched uranium, which is so important, essential to building nuclear weapons, even the IAEA was not sure where all of that was. Some of it can be moved, and so is it now in clandestine labs, clandestine facilities? We really don't know. But if in fact these bombs went right down into the heart of that mountain and blew up the Fordo facility, it would be obviously a massive setback for Iran's nuclear program.
Chris, you have been to the region so many times over the years, and especially since Israel's war in Gaza began 2 years ago. Talk to me a little bit about how Israelis are feeling about the potential of a broader conflict. We're getting some indication from the IDF that the level of alert and defense systems has been escalated in terms of people being advised to avoid things like gatherings and so on. So definitely there is presumably a fear there that there will be a possible retaliatory attack from Iran. There's, of course, Iran's proxies, groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, which, yes, have been weakened by Israel's war, but that do still, in fact, exist. Tell me about what is the feeling in the country in terms of the potential threat to the safety of Israeli civilians that this could pose?
Well, the immediate reaction was to issue more restrictive measures. As you say, banning public gatherings, schools are going to be closed for the foreseeable future. It essentially returns Israel to a situation that it was in the opening hours, opening days of the war with Iran. They had loosened things up a little bit. Now they're going to go back to, as I say, the more tighter configuration. More broadly than that, I think it's fair to say there's quite widespread support in Israel for attacking Iran, for Benjamin Netanyahu's actions. None of the major opposition parties here were offside on this. There is a rally around the flag moment. And I expect, but when daylight comes, you're going to see much of the same kind of response as well. There will be perhaps even moments of euphoria, because that is kind of what it was like in the opening hours of this, when it appeared 8 or 9 days ago that Israel had scored a number of important tactical successes, taking out Iran's Air Force, lots of its missile defenses, essentially giving Israeli jets a free roaming of the skies over Tehran and all of these nuclear sites. So I suspect that you're going to feel a little bit of that. I should say it was tempered quite a bit once some of those missiles, ballistic missiles from Iran started getting through and then started getting past the missile shield, and we started to see civilians getting killed. Some 24 civilians have been killed, and many thousands, in fact, wounded by these missile attacks. Israelis have been, I would say, reacting the way they've been taught when these missiles come in, and I think that has also made a difference. People going to these safe rooms, staying inside, even in high-rise buildings, there's more secure parts of the floors than others, people going in there when these alarms sound, and I think that has reduced the number of fatalities from some of these attacks, and it's also kept perhaps support for this war going. I think the fear here was that this turned into something that was drawn out, a war of attrition. Israelis remember their history. They know the Six-Day War in 1967 was a great success, in part from their point of view, because it was only 6 days. And so I think there was a sense that the timing this had to happen fast if it was going to happen. And from an Israeli point of view, they did not want this to get drawn out into many more weeks or possibly even months. So that 2-week deadline that Donald Trump set wasn't really a deadline. That 2-week time period that he set, it really didn't feel like it was firm, or it was even something that was going to be followed.
Chris, thank you so much for that. And I know you'll be staying on this story for us in the hours and days to come. That's CBC's Chris Brown reporting in Jerusalem. And my colleague and friend Natasha Fatah is here with us. I know you're so knowledgeable on this conflict and on the region generally. Let's talk a little bit about the reactions of the Iranian diaspora in Canada. We're talking close to 300,000 people.
There is a huge Iranian diaspora here, and it is varied in its political perspectives. And it's interesting, just based on the contacts that who I'm looking at on social media, what they are posting, the messages that they're sending me, it's been this very disappointed resignation that, okay, we knew this could happen. We were really hoping that it wouldn't, but now here we are. Part of the problem for so many in the diaspora is not that all of them want regime change, but enough that a substantial, significant number of Iranians living abroad, and as we have been reporting, so many within the nation do want regime change.
And we know many in Canada did come around 1979 when the Shah was deposed and Ayatollah Khomeini took over back then. So for those people, complex feelings, I'm imagining.
Complex feelings, and also we might be on the verge of another refugee crisis if this war just between Israel and Iran continues. If the United States stays on it and continues its air assault, and people are told to flee Tehran, where are they going to go? We know they're heading to Azerbaijan, Armenia, to Turkey. On the opposite end of the map, they could go to Afghanistan and Pakistan. They have done that in the past. In the 70s and 80s, many Iranians flew to Pakistan and then found their ways to other countries. But at this stage, things are so tumultuous in Afghanistan and Pakistan that we see almost everyone is fleeing towards the West. So there's a possibility of a crisis there, but so many people in the diaspora are worried about their loved ones who cannot flee. Either they are sick, they have young children, they are elderly, they are physically incapable, they don't have the means. Not everyone can get in their car, get on that highway, and try to get to Isfahan and beyond. So they're stuck there, And they don't know. They're hedging their bets. How long is this going to last? Returning to my point about the regime change, many people want it, but what I have heard repeatedly is that regime change should not come like this. Ideally, and as we've heard from Iranians for so long, for 4 decades, if the supreme leader is going to be overthrown, if there is going to be a democratic government in play, or any kind of government of the Iranian people's choosing, they want to be responsible for how it comes about. They don't want it to come at the hands of the United States and the Israelis bombing them out of existence.
It's so interesting because we've seen this play out in other countries too, that sometimes while the American expectation tends to be that this will awake people to the horrors of their regime, it sometimes has the counterproductive effect, meaning that it makes them cleave closer to their leadership, even if they despise it, because it is difficult to feel an allegiance to the powers that are bombing your civilians, the elderly and the children. And we've seen even in the last few days the complexity of those feelings. People who, as you said, have said if somebody should depose this regime, it should be us. Iranian people are proud people, one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, and they have been through many regimes over their long history. And then on the other hand, we have seen protests burning the flags of U.S., of Israel. So it's going to be so interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, we've talked to Iranian Canadians, and we'll continue to, about their feelings, as you said. So many have. The grandparents, the parents,
It
right?
is. And let me bring up one final point on this issue of regime change, because I was speaking with a former lieutenant general with the U.S. Army earlier today. And I brought to him, because he was serving under the U.S. Army when they were in Iraq and when they were in Afghanistan. And I said, what about when you all left and the people there were worse off than before you had gone in? And he said, well, it's up to the people to decide what they're going to, it has to be the will of the Iranians what will replace it. But how? How? When the regime and the IRGC owns everything. I mean, from bakeries to hair salons to the banks. They own everything, and we know everyone in the world acknowledges that the Iranian regime is not above slaughtering its own people should they rise up. So while there is room for the West, is what we've heard from Iranians, to assist, to support an internal movement to overthrow the regime, there needs to be an acknowledgement that you can't just leave us in a vacuum, because we do not want a repeat of what happened in Kabul just a few years ago.
Natasha, thank you so much for that. And I'm so glad you're sharing the duties with me tonight, because you have such knowledge and passion for this. I do wish that we were here together on a happier circumstance. But here we are. We're going to try to bring you the news as they come in on this evolving situation. And Natasha will be joining us for the rest of the night as well. Now, let's go back to Washington, where we're joined by CBC's Karen Pauls. Karen, bring us up to speed with what we know so far about this U.S. attack.
Right. Well, I mean, just before 8 o'clock local, that first social media tweet by President Donald Trump, he said he was giving himself up to 2 weeks to decide whether to intervene in this war, but it was less than 3 days. In the first social media tweet post, he said, "We have completed our very successful attack on the 3 nuclear sites in Iran. All planes are now outside of Iran airspace. A full payload of bombs was dropped on the primary site, Fordo. All planes safely on their way home." And he congratulated the military, saying no other military in the world could have done this, saying, again, now is the time for peace. And then he also put up another post saying he will address the nation from the White House at 10 o'clock, which is in about 15 minutes, saying this is an important historic moment for the United States of America, Israel, and the world. Iran must now agree to end this war. Thank you. And so we'll be hearing from the president in 15 or so minutes. Those nuclear sites are the ones, Fordo's, the one buried in the mountain, Natanz and Isfahan. Isfahan is the research complex, the nuclear research complex. Trump is saying that in a media post that Fordo is gone. In a phone call, he told Reuters this was an amazing success tonight, and Iran should make peace or they'll be hit again. We're hearing Iran's state-run news agency has acknowledged an attack on Fordo, quoting a statement saying a few hours ago, when COM air forces were activated and hostile targets were identified, part of the Fordo nuclear site was attacked by enemies. Residents near the nuclear plant apparently hearing explosions. And we know that American B-2 bombers are the only ones who can carry the bunker-busting bombs that can attack this nuclear site underground. We heard earlier today that they'd appeared to have taken off from an airbase in Missouri, heading west over the Pacific, headed towards Guam, where they refueled. At the time, U.S. defense officials were saying that any movement of those bombers was just intended to provide the president with options, not to signify anything particular. But Trump did return from his golf course in New Jersey, met with his national security team in the Oval Office this evening, and then a few hours later, that first announcement of the bombing. We know these are the only planes capable of carrying those bombs, and each of those B-2 bombers can carry 2 of those bombs, which weigh 30,000 pounds each. So we're hearing now that the U.S. State Department is starting to evacuate Americans from Israel, and we'll see what happens next.
Next, so many question marks there. Karen, have we heard any reaction yet, either from Washington or internationally?
Yeah, we're starting to hear some domestic reaction on X, on social media. Here's one from Speaker Mike Johnson saying the military operations in Iran should serve as a clear reminder to our adversaries and allies that President Trump means what he says. The president gave Iran's leader every opportunity to make a deal, but Iran refused to commit to a nuclear disarmament agreement. The president has been consistent and clear that a nuclear-armed Iran will not be tolerated, and that posture has now been enforced with strength, precision, and clarity. He's saying this is America First policy in action. We're also hearing from Senator John Fetterman, also in a post on X, saying that this was the correct move by the president, that Iran is the world's leading sponsor of terrorism and cannot have nuclear capabilities, saying he's grateful for and salutes the finest military in the world. But we know that there has been a lot of division, not only with Democrats, but also within the Republican Party. We're hearing some negative responses. Congresswoman Yasemin Ansari saying Donald Trump illegally took military action against Iran without congressional authorization, risking dragging us into another endless war. And she says, I am calling for an immediate emergency session of Congress to vote on the War Powers Resolution. And again, we've seen a split, a bit of a rift within the conservatives, some saying that Donald Trump needs to attack and be part of this military action with Israel because Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Others, particularly from the MAGA side, saying that he promised not to involve the U.S. in foreign wars. That's what he campaigned on. That's what they voted on. And they were hoping that he would stick to that. He was sort of giving himself a little bit of time to come to a decision. Some military analysts were saying maybe that time was actually to move military assets into the region to give himself those options. But nonetheless, it didn't take 2 weeks. It took 2 and a bit days. And now we know that those bombs have been dropped. We'll hear a little more from the president in about 10 minutes, speaking to the nation.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to hear what he has to say, Karen. We do know that some very prominent personalities in MAGA, including Tucker Carlson, who, of course, is not an elected official, but a people that many people listen to, was vocally opposed to U.S. involvement in this war. So it'll be interesting to see what he says now that this has happened. Thank you so much for this, Karen. CBC's Karen Pauls in Washington.
For more on this developing story, we're joined now by retired U.S. Marine Colonel Mark Cancian. He's a senior advisor at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and he's joining us from Arlington, Virginia. Colonel, thank you so much for making time for us tonight.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Sir, we are about 8 minutes away, if the president is on time, from hearing from him. What is your best information? What are you hearing about the kind of bombs that were used by the U.S. military today on Iran?
Well, there's no question that for Fordo and Natanz, the U.S. used these large bunker busters, as we just heard. These are GBU-57s. For the Isfahan targets, they didn't have to use those. There may be some underground elements or some hardened elements that they wanted to use them on. A little hard to say there, but it's pretty much what we were expecting. That is, B-2s going in at night and striking these targets that the Israelis would have a very hard time taking out themselves. One thing that surprised me a little is they say that there was only 2 bombs each on Fordo and Natanz. I was expecting more, but maybe 2 were enough.
So does this mean the possibility of nuclear weaponry is eliminated in Iran? I mean, what's our best sense of that?
Well, you can never eliminate the possibility that they would rebuild their program. They still have much of the expertise available to them, but there's no question it's been set back for many years, and that may convince them that it's not worth to put the billions and billions of dollars into the program to rebuild it. They might be more willing to make some sort of deal. We've seen this in the past with Iraq. In the 1980s, the Israelis took out the Iraqi reactor, which was working on some nuclear capabilities, and the Iraqis never rebuilt it.
What do we know of Iran's capabilities to fight back?
Well, Iran has basically 2 tools to fight back with. The first are missiles, and of course they've been firing those at Israel. The inventory is getting lower, but they have some, and they can fire those at U.S. bases in the region. They have done that in the past. The other tool they have is their proxies. That is, these are various insurgent groups that are armed and inspired by Iran. They have groups in Iraq, for example. They have Hezbollah, which is now much weakened, Hamas, the Houthis, and they might take some shots at U.S. Forces in the region. There's also some small chance that they would be able to infiltrate some sort of terrorist network into the United States. The United States is watching that very carefully. It's not impossible, but it would be limited. It would be some sort of suicide bombing or something like that.
The president has said that mission has been accomplished, it's been successful, and he's imploring the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table and to use diplomacy now as they move forward. But is it done for the United States? Could we see further attacks?
It sounds like the president's going to give a pause here for the Iranians to come back to the negotiating table to make a deal. He could go back. It's important to note here that the 3 targets that they struck are all nuclear targets, and they're all targets, or at least 2 of them, that the Israelis were having a hard time taking out. This is not a broader effort to overthrow the Iranian regime, at least so far. It's a narrow effort to take out the Iranian nuclear capabilities, set that program back. And frankly, if the United States wanted to do that, this is the moment. For 20 years, U.S. presidents have been saying Iran cannot be allowed to get nuclear weapons. This is the moment to make that happen if the United States is serious about it.
Okay. Colonel Mark Cancian, thank you so much for your time this evening, sir.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Now, as we continue to wait to hear from President Donald Trump, we are hearing now from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu discussing the U.S. strikes on Iran. Let's take a listen.
Trump, your bold decision to target Iran's nuclear facilities with the awesome and righteous might of the United States will change history. In Operation Rising Lion, Israel has done truly amazing things. But in tonight's action against Iran's nuclear facilities, America has been truly unsurpassed. It has done what no other country on earth could do. History will record that President Trump acted to deny the world's most dangerous regime the world's most dangerous weapons. His leadership today has created a pivot of history that can help lead the Middle East and beyond to a future of prosperity and peace. President Trump and I often say, peace through strength. First comes strength, then comes peace. And tonight, President Trump and the United States acted with a lot of strength. President Trump, I thank you. The people of Israel thank you. The forces of civilization thank you. God bless America. God bless Israel. And may God bless our unshakable alliance, our unbreakable faith.
Okay, that statement just coming into our newsroom moments ago, that of course is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu responding to the U.S. attacks on Iran. I want to once again turn to our host, Deanna Sumanak-Johnson. Deanna, it's short, but there's a lot there. What jumped out at for you?
Peace through strength. First comes strength, then comes peace. I was thinking about those notable pronouncements on what makes for a peaceful world that we've had throughout history, like peace in our times and so on. This is really one that, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu has believed in for a while, peace on his terms. And tonight, Donald Trump has helped deliver on that. I think it's really interesting to see how that relationship has evolved. We know that there were some, they both have verbalized frustration at the time that Joe Biden was president, and that Benjamin Netanyahu did not always feel that Joe Biden was doing what he would want him to do. Definitely there seems to be more affinity between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu. He said this is a win for our forces of civilization, which is frankly, a very big pronouncement that, you know, reaffirming once again that Iran has, with its nuclear potential, which once again, Israel said was absolutely with the intent of developing a nuclear bomb. Iran has maintained that it is for nuclear energy, for civilian purposes, but that the threat to Israel is tantamount to the threat to the Western world. Obviously, many other nations in the region will have different thoughts on that. And I think that's one thing that we're all keeping an eye on, the reactions from outside the U.S., outside of Iran and outside of Israel. Whether it's, I think Chris Brown pointed out, the complicated relationship between the primarily Arabic and in many cases Sunni nations surrounding Iran and primarily Shia Iranians, that there is obviously not a lot of love for Israel among the Muslim majority nations, but nor is there a very cozy relationship with Iran on part of a lot of these countries. So I think that I'm waiting to hear what Saudi Arabia will say, what Egypt will have to say, some of those other powerful players in the region. But a person who will have probably a better idea about that than me is CBC's Chris Brown. He's joining us again from Jerusalem. Chris, I don't know if you were able to hear that short address by Benjamin Netanyahu in which he thanked the U.S. And pronounced that this is peace through strength, something that both him and Donald Trump believe in, according to Benjamin Netanyahu. Tell me, how does this play into what you've seen from Netanyahu so far in the last, frankly, few years, but especially in the last 9 days since Israel first bombed Iran?
Well, this was a minute and 20 seconds, a statement Benjamin Netanyahu likely has wanted to give his whole career. In many ways, this is a culmination of his very long, very successful political career as Prime Minister of Israel. He's led this country for almost 20 years, and I'm speculating, but it's probably not a far off the mark to say tonight is a night that he probably has dreamed about for a long, long time, because he has spoken at length, particularly since October the 7th, when Hamas attacked southern Israel, about the need to address what in the opinion of many Israelis were the forces behind Hamas, and
Chris,
that is
I'm
the
so sorry.
government of Iran.
Chris, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but Donald Trump has just started his address. We'll join you shortly
in the
after. Let's
Iranian
go to the White House
regime,
right now.
Fordo, Natanz, and Esfahan. Everybody heard those names for years as they built this horribly destructive enterprise. Our objective was the destruction of Iran's nuclear enrichment capacity and a stop to the nuclear threat posed by the world's #1 state sponsor of terror.